Well, the great showing that we had all been waiting for has come and gone, namely the 15-minute, well, it was a bit more than 15 minutes to be perfectly honest, gameplay showing of The Blood of Dawnwalker. And how I'm going to proceed is basically give my overall impressions, then first the negatives and then the positives, and then I'll summarize. Overall, I thought it looked quite good. And I say this primarily because what we were looking at is basically alpha or pre-beta, however you wish to term it, and I liked what I saw. It's very obviously the case that this was heavily inspired by The Witcher, and specifically Witcher 3. You can see tons of UI similarities in the combat, we'll get into that, similarities in inventory to some degree, and it also makes sense. I mean, it's coming from the creators of The Witcher, basically, so you shouldn't complain about that. It's perfectly fine. It's all good. So overall, it looks pretty good. I think it definitely has that feeling of a dark medieval setting from what I can tell. No complaints there. That is my very broad strokes overall impression. As I said, I'm going to start with the things that I didn't think were that great. One concern I had that occurred to me after I looked at the conversation in the cathedral at daytime between the priest and Cohen was the facial animations. They really look stiff to me, in the sense that the lip sync seemed pretty off. I could see the priest uttering words, but the lips weren't moving in sync with the words. Cohen had a bit of that issue too. And the characters, in terms of their facial animations, seem to have a little bit of what I refer to as the dead zombie eye look, where the eye area is a bit uncanny. It looks literally dead, more or less. Now, again, obviously, this is pre-beta, alpha, however you wish to term it, as I said. And so this is to be forgiven. We don't know what the game is going to look like as a final product, but the facial animations are somewhat concerning. Now, if they fix the eye area up, and most importantly, get the lip sync right, so it looks accurate and realistic when people are talking, the lips are moving in sync with the words that they're speaking, then I don't really see this as a problem. This is just a potential problem going forward if they don't bother to look into this and touch it up a bit. The other negative, I would say, which is, I guess to some people's perspective might be weird, is there was a Q&A, and one of the questions asked, I guess a classic, was, will there be romance in this game? Now, I know I am infamous for my rejection of romance in many games and the fact that I just don't think romance is very important. Call me old school. But I have very specific objections to the idea of even having romance in this type of game that I think you will agree with me on to a large extent, at the very least, because it just doesn't make sense at the end of the day. My understanding of the plot is that you have approximately a month, give or take, to rescue or save your family from the vampire Lord Brensis, who is holding your family in his castle. Therefore, this is a game of urgency, in some sense. You have a limited amount of time. Time is a resource, we'll talk about that. And it doesn't make sense to me if you are a half vampire, half human, who is running against the clock to make sure your family is safe from the demonic vampire Lord Brensis, that you even have time to consider romance. And more importantly, in the span of 1 month, you're supposed to be able to romance anyone in the first place. Just imagine the following scenario. Cohen is trying to develop and perfect his swordsmanship skills. He's learning rituals and spells. Maybe he's, dabbling a little bit to the darker side with his vampiric powers. But at the same time, he encounters Martha the Milkmaid. And he's so taken in by Martha the Milkmaid that he decides to put his swords down for a while and not cast his spells and try to delay his vampiric degeneration just so he can romance her and boink her, frankly. That doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And what's more, there are 3 romances in the game. You have to have your options, right? This sounds to me, at the end of the day, almost like a checklist, because most people in modern times, if you wish to frame it that way, expect and require romance in RPGs. This was not always the case back in the day. There were perfectly fine and excellent RPGs from way back in the day that had no romance. They were more than playable. They were fantastic. And I think romance has to fit within the context of something greater, as it were. So I can well imagine a game such as Exodus or The Expanse, where the implication is that it goes over a long period of time, that you getting to know a companion or a squad mate and falling in love with them as the protagonist. That could make sense. But in a game where you have a month, give or take, to rescue your family from diabolical vampire lords, and you are on the clock, it doesn't make much sense to me. I think you will, if you think about this, agree with me on this. Even if you like romance in games, it doesn't make sense in the context of Blood of Dawnwalker. I would have preferred had they invested those resources that they're putting in romance into other things. But hey, that's just me. Maybe I'm completely off base about this. Who knows? So, those would be the only things that struck me as actually negative. Like I said, pretty good looking considering it's alpha or pre-beta, whatever. As far as the things I thought were pretty cool or positive, there was a number of them. I generally like the combat they introduced. It's relatively simple, obviously reminiscent of The Witcher 3, but with more skill involved, directionality, that sort of thing. So it looks good. It looks to have a degree of complexity, but not so much complexity that you're overwhelmed. I think that's important. You want the combat to be fun. You want it to be doable, but you also want it to be somewhat challenging. But on the other hand, you also don't want it to be Dark Souls or Sekiro or Elden Ring. This game ultimately is about the story. The combat is there to facilitate the story, push it along, and be fun in the process. So you want to really strike that balance. And from what I could see, limited offering though it was, the combat looks to fit that criterion. Fun, somewhat complex, somewhat challenging, not a pushover, but not overwhelmingly so that you're frustrating yourself to no end and you're smashing your mouse against your table. And that does happen in other games, I can assure you. So I like that about the combat. I like the, I guess you could say, branching perks or trees. You have the human perks, you have the overlapping ones, and you have the vampiric ones, although they're not referred to as vampiric. I think that's cool too. They obviously use their own in-house created name for vampire. And it reminds me of the possibility of builds, basically. I like theory crafting and builds as much as the next guy. And so already I'm thinking to myself, I think what I'll do in my first playthrough is a sort of human, moral Cohen who does not fall to the dark side and rejects his dark powers, feeds exclusively on animal blood, and never feeds on humans, and focuses primarily on his swordsmanship skills, so basically a warrior type. And I'm hoping that's an option. Clearly, you fight with a sword, and you have to kill enemies with a sword in some scenarios, and so I guess there must be options for expanded swordplay, different moves, maybe better reaction time, this sort of thing. And I hope to the gods that that is an aspect of the game that you can fully explore. Now, of course, you can mix and match things, obviously, but I'm the type that in many games prefers single class and all the way, no multi-classing. So it'd be really cool in this instance if for my first playthrough, I could just play a swordsman Cohen who goes around slashing enemies, fighting the vampires with his wits and sword. Of course, you have the dark powers too. I like that idea. But I suppose most practically, and I think this is cool, you have the abilities, the perks that overlap. And since it's unavoidable that you spend at least some time during the night in vampire form, maybe those are the best perks at the end of the day. Maybe the best perks are, in fact, the perks that overlap, because you can make use of both of them in human form and in vampire form. But I like that idea. I like sort of mixing and matching, but I also like the idea, as I said, of just being a noble warrior. And who knows, maybe if you're a really, really, really noble and good Cohen, you can get a holy sword or develop some holy magical powers that you learn from the local saints or their spirits in the fight against Brensis. So the combat looked to me either serviceable or quite good considering what it's supposed to do. I'm not expecting, as I said, Dark Souls. I don't even enjoy that. It's fine. Looks fun. Looks cool. As far as the ability to traverse things, the parkour aspects, if you will, I thought that was really cool. I love exploring rooftops and mountains and this sort of thing. So I'm definitely going to enjoy that, even if I want on my first playthrough to not fully exploit the vampiric powers. It does seem nifty. Now, getting back to the whole time as a resource thing, I like the fact, and I think this is really important because this was a legitimate concern of a lot of people in the beginning, that time would not be a resource. Time is basically a ticking clock, and you have to rush and run against that clock. No, in fact, you kind of choose when time comes to pass. So if you want to explore the valley and discover miscellaneous things, miscellaneous quests, of which there seems to be a fair bit. I mean, they suggest all kinds of quests you can pick up on if you just sort of listen in on people and conversations in the towns or cities, or you follow certain pieces of evidence, because then again, there's that thing that looks very much like the Witcher census, where you're sort of picking up scents and trails, and sometimes you discover notes and pieces of evidence. There's that. And of course, towards the end, they showed the ability to actually communicate with the dead vis-a-vis some ritual magic called Compel Soul, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm 100% going to make use of that, because apparently you can get quests and learn new information that way too. Maybe it'll even help you, they say, to beat Brensis. So that explorability, the sandboxness, if you will, of the game, which they're presenting to us in this short 15-minute gameplay, it's not a lot, does seem to be convincing to me. I did enjoy that. And for my part, I'm the type that just really likes to just run out into the wilds and explore things. You can drink animal blood, so I guess they're deer or wolves or whatever, and I guess I'll be hunting those animals. But I could just see myself, starting off and just running to the forest or the mountains and just seeing what's there. Maybe I'll discover something, rather than in some sequential way following the quest. I know a lot of people do it that way. I prefer to sort of wander about and then see what happens. And I like that about what they're presenting to us. I liked what they showed to us. The cathedral itself looked really cool. I like the fact that it really captures that Gothic essence of the time. And I like the clue aspect too. Again, I thought that was really nifty. The notes, the detective element, because they suggest that the saints are being covered up for some reason. There's probably a mystical or magical reason for that. You can, of course, also see in the cathedral that the art depicts not saints or God or various religious figures, but rather Brensis, Xantha, and Amber's effectively as saints and or gods. So basically, they have decided to start their own cult. We kind of already knew this during the baptism, which I thought was done in relatively decent Latin to boot. You have a pool or a fountain of blood that you baptize the child with. And the cathedral just looked very impressive overall. And the whole city itself, I thought, looked really cool. Looked like something very neat that I want to explore in great detail and just kind of discover all the secrets of. But to be honest, I want to explore the countryside, the mountains, the forest even more, because I have this feeling about that. And what I also liked was the fact that they mentioned that you can theoretically do everything from the get-go. So you could theoretically storm the castle at level 1, when you're just starting off, and maybe somehow through a miracle defeat Brensis and his vampires. Maybe you could do that. Chances are very, very slim, but at least it's theoretically possible. That's the suggestion of the developers. Just as you could defeat potentially Xantha at that very early stage they showed us in the game as well. Difficult, but not impossible. And we all know there are going to be some autists that try it, Level 1 Cohen storming the castle against all the vampire lords and their minions, and somehow they managed to do it. I'm probably not going to be skilled enough to do that, to be honest. I'm too old. But it nonetheless seems like a cool option to have. And besides, I want to explore this game to the fullest and see everything it has to offer. So, yeah, I'm not going to be rushing anything. I'm going to be taking my sweet old time to check out every nook and cranny. And the magic system I like a lot too. I like the fact this is a low magic setting. Historically, in terms of fantasy, you have high magic and low magic. And low magic settings in general are pretty cool because they have that element of the mysterious, the dark, the hidden, which is the case here. I mean, it's a dark medieval setting set in the plague-ridden east of Europe. And I like the idea that they're rituals, that they have a cost. They basically cost you blood or life essence, and they're not easy to cast. So that's another option potentially for a type of Koan you might want to play. Maybe a sort of rune casting, ritual casting Koan, almost like a sign casting Geralt in The Witcher 3. So overall, I liked what I saw. Again, alpha, pre-beta. For what it was, it looked very good. I have a few points of criticism, which I mentioned at the beginning, but in general, it looks like they are delivering what they promised. And this remains probably the game that I'm looking forward to the most in the next year or two, just because I dig the entire setting. I love the idea of a historical medieval European setting with supernatural elements. I vastly prefer that to just purely fictional settings. This is much better to my mind. And I love the fact that Rebel Wolves is undertaking this. So really, really like that. One final point of criticism, not of the game, but of something else, is I don't think these elaborate presentations are necessary. They tend to take up a lot of time. You have the countdown. They spend, I imagine, quite a bit of money in preparation and doing it all. The presenters and developers act like actors, no pun intended, and I just don't think that's necessary. It would have been just as good if they had just had gameplay that was narrated by a developer in an efficient and descriptive manner, and I think going forward, that's probably the way to do it. I get the idea with the sword play and the walking around the old villages and the people presenting things from the castle. It's really cool in theory, but in actuality, I think it detracts from what gamers really want to see, which is gameplay. We as gamers care primarily about the gameplay, less about the fanfare and the LARPing. And I don't mean that in a terrible, negative way, just that I think it would be better for everyone involved if things shown in the future are just gameplay with some narration from a developer explaining what's going on. Anyway, those are my impressions. Those are my takes regarding this. I was not disappointed. Quite the opposite. Blood of Dawnwalker still remains firmly my #1 title for the next year or two, sitting above pretty much anything else, including Exodus, Expanse, and other games. So we'll just have to see. At the end of the day, as I always say, only the gods know how this game ultimately will turn out, and we will find that out upon final release. But as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you like my content, and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. It's very much appreciated as it really helps out the channel. And I'll check you out next time. Take care.